When World War I broke out across Europe in 1914, the US maintained a neutral stance and continued to engage in commerce and shipping with European countries on both sides of the conflict. The sinking of the British ocean liner Lusitania by a German U-boat in 1915 swayed the American public opinion away from neutrality, but it did not sway President Woodrow Wilson, who let off Germany with a simple warning to stop unannounced submarine warfare. But in January 1917, the British intercepted and deciphered an encrypted message from Germany to Mexico, asking Mexico to ally with Germany against the United States in the war. That was enough for President Woodrow Wilson to seek congressional support on April 2, 1917, to declare war against Germany. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we continue our coverage of World War I and take it to its conclusion along with the armistice that was signed at the end of the war. One of the biggest impacts of World War I on the social front was the expansion in the employment of women in the workforce. With millions of men away from home, women ended up filling the manufacturing and agricultural positions on the home front. There was a need on the front lines as well, and many women served on the front lines as nurses, doctors, ambulance drivers, translators, and sometimes, in rare cases, even on the battlefield. In 1914, the German armaments manufacturer Krupp employed almost no women. But by 1917, women made up nearly 30% of its 175,000 workers. And at the national level, nearly 1.4 million German women were employed in the war labor force. Britain, too, was not too far behind. In July of 1914, 3.3 million women worked in paid employment in Britain. But by July of 1917, 4.7 million women worked in paid employment. British women served in uniform, as well as in the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force. Another significant social shift, specifically in America, was that African American women were able to make their first major shift from domestic employment to work in offices and factories. The medical profession was another major area of employment during World War I for women, and organizations like the Salvation Army, the Red Cross, US Army Nurse Corps employed several thousand doctors and nurses to take care of the wounded on the front lines during the course of the war. Back to the war front. World War I was technically being fought on two fronts, as I mentioned before, one on the Russia-German border and the other on the French-German border, so the Eastern Front and the Western Front. But a third front opened once the Ottoman Empire decided to join the war. But by late 1915, all three fronts had ended up in a stalemate. Heavy fighting, heavy casualties, but not much progress with respect to troop advances. As Britain started hitting a stalemate too against the Ottoman Empire, in March of 1915, it signed a secret agreement with Russia. Now, the aim here was that the Ottoman Empire was crumbling. It was expected that it would not survive World War I. So Britain, France, and Russia started having discussions on how the Ottoman territory would be divided after the war. And the first of these agreements was in March 1915, wherein Britain promised Russia the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, and the control of the Dardanelles, which is the strait connecting the Black Sea with the Mediterranean. Essentially, Russia was getting an important trade route. In exchange, Britain would get access to the oil-rich regions of Central Persia and Mesopotamia. However, to win against the Ottomans, the British needed the support of the Arabs in that region who had been revolting against the Turks in the Ottoman Empire. And to get the Arabs to formally revolt against the Ottoman Empire, the British promised the Arabs to recognize the independence of the mostly Arab regions around Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Iraq. However, to be clear, the British did mention that they would recognize all territories which were primarily Arab, but were non-committal with respect to areas that they didn't consider purely Arab. And this gray area would become a bone of contention in that region in the future. And with this commitment from the British, the Arabs, led by Sharif Hussain, struck at the Ottoman garrisons in May of 1916 and proclaimed Arab independence. Within 3 weeks, the Ottoman garrison in Mecca fell, followed shortly by many other towns in the peninsula. The Arab forces were supplied by Britain, and several British officers served as military advisors. But the most prominent among them was Colonel T.E. Lawrence, aka Lawrence of Arabia. And sensing a victory in the Ottoman region, the British and French secretly reached an accord known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement in May of 1916. Under this, most of the Arab lands under the rule of the Ottoman Empire would be divided into British and French spheres of influence at the conclusion of World War I. And around the same time, the biggest naval battle of World War I was fought in the North Sea between the British and German fleets. The Battle of Jutland. In the initial phase of the war, the German Navy had chosen not to confront the superior British Royal Navy, relying mostly on its U-boat submarines to do the job. But in May of 1916, when the majority of the British Grand Fleet had anchored at Scapa Flow, which is the northernmost tip of Scotland, the commander of the German High Seas Fleet believed that the time was right to launch an attack on the British coastline. He was confident that his communications were securely coded, so he ordered 19 U-boat submarines to position themselves for a raid on the English coastal city of Sunderland. And he was using reconnaissance aircraft to keep an eye on the British fleet's movement from Scapa Flow. Now, during World War I, aviation technology was still in its very initial stages. So the aircraft were used just for spying missions. But the weather conditions on that day were bad, so the aircraft were not of much help. So the German vice admiral called off the raid and instead ordered his fleet to head to a waterway located between Norway and northern Denmark off the Jutland Peninsula. The ultimate aim was to punch a hole in the British defenses so that the blockade set by the British could be broken. But the Germans did not know that a newly created intelligence unit within the British Navy had cracked the German codes and warned the British Grand Fleet's commander of the German intentions. So consequently, on the night of May the 30th, the Royal Navy fleet stationed at Scapa Flow set out for the Jutland Peninsula in the North Sea. And on the afternoon of May the 31st, 1916, the opening phase of the greatest naval battle of World War I, the Battle of Jutland, had begun. Over the course of the next 72 hours, 100,000 men aboard 250 ships engaged in battle at sea. Both sides bore heavy losses, but the battle ended on July 4, 1916, with the Germans unable to penetrate the British defenses and reporting back to German High Command that further fleet action was not an option and that submarine warfare was Germany's best hope for victory at sea. So as the war progressed through 1916, with the lack of any decisive victories, the battle fatigue started to seep in. Germany was running short on supplies, and that was frustrating the frontline soldiers. But at the same time, the Allied powers had an open supply chain from the United States. And it is here that Germany tried to put an end to the supply lines to the Allied powers by restarting its submarine attacks around January of 1917. And around the same time, it reached out to Mexico to join the Central Powers against the United States in World War I. By April 1917, the US Senate voted 82-6 to declare war on the Central Powers, that is the German, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire combined. While we talked about the crumbling Ottoman Empire, there was another empire which was also nearing its end. That was the Russian Empire, and the war fatigue related to World War I accelerated that end. One of the major reasons for stalemate along the Eastern Front was Russia's inability to supply enough arms and ammunition to equip its 1.4 million man army. It is said that the situation was so bad that some soldiers had gone into battle unarmed, waiting for a fellow soldier to get killed so they could pick their rifle. The generation of the war fatigue due to the stalemate on the Eastern Front, coupled with long lines for bread at home, created the situations rife for a rebellion. And when the Tsar soldiers themselves joined the protesters, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to step down from the monarchy, thereby ending the rule of the Romanov dynasty. The monarchy was replaced by a provisional government, which was composed of moderates, some socialists and liberals who fought amongst themselves as they tried to get Russia under control again. The Germans had been trying hard to avoid fighting on two fronts, so they got super excited with the new developments in Russia, and they felt that if they could destabilize the provisional government even further, Russia may opt out of World War I. So the Germans arranged for Vladimir Lenin, the communist leader of the Bolshevik Party, to return from his European exile to Russia in a secret train. And he arrived with his slogan, "Peace, Land, Bread," in an appeal to get the Russians out of the war. After a series of revolutions, rebellions, and other turns of events, Russia signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty with Germany and Austria-Hungary in March of 1918, giving up 1 million square miles of territory on the eastern side, and this included areas like Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Estonia, etc. With Russia out of the conflict, Germany moved quickly on the Western Front, hoping to inflict a quick defeat on the Allied powers before the United States joined them. Though the right strategy, but Germany was not able to hold fort for too long as the US reinforcements started coming in. And slowly, the tide of the war started moving in favor of the Allied forces. Around October of 1917, the British Army was able to gain victory at the gates of Gaza, which was an Ottoman territory, and the British prepared to enter Palestine. Now, Palestine had a sizable Jewish population, so to gain support of the Jewish population in Palestine, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued the Balfour Declaration on November 2nd, 1917, promising the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Yes, the foundation of modern-day Israel was laid during World War I by the British. In July of 1918, German troops launched what would become the last German offensive of the war, attacking the Allied forces in the Second Battle of Marne, close to the French-Belgian border. The Allies successfully pushed back the German offensive and were able to launch their own counteroffensive just 3 days later. The Germans suffered massive casualties and called off all planned offensives in the future. The Ottoman Empire, too, faced several reverses following the Arab Revolt and other defeats that devastated its economy as well as the land area. So the Ottoman Turks signed a treaty with the Allies in late October 1918. Within Austria-Hungary, a lot of nationalist movements arose due to World War I amongst its diverse population. Unable to put down these revolts, Austria-Hungary reached an armistice on November the 4th, 1918. Germany too started witnessing many revolts and mutinies against the war, primarily due to dwindling resources. The Kaiser was forced to abdicate, and the new government finally sought an armistice on November 11, 1918, formally ending World War I. Subsequently, the Big Four leaders of the victorious nations, that is, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Italy, met in Versailles near Paris to codify the peace terms following World War I. Russia was not invited because it had already concluded a peace treaty with Germany, and the defeated powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey, were not represented. One of the big covenants coming out of this treaty was the creation of the League of Nations, which would be an international organization aimed at preserving peace. Basically, the precursor to the United Nations. The League of Nations was the brainchild of US President Woodrow Wilson, but strangely enough, the US never became its member. Great Britain and France, who had suffered a lot of economic impact from the World War I, wanted to weaken Germany and make it pay heavy reparations. The reparations started with Germany losing 20% of its territory and 10% of its population. Most of the 20% loss of territory was a gain for Poland. Due to this, Germany ended up being split into two areas. The one primary area, which was close to the French border, and the second, which was north of Poland. And all German colonies at the time were divided up among the victors. The German army and navy was severely dismantled, and it was forbidden from maintaining an air force. Then there was the Article 231 of the treaty, better known as the War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept full responsibility for starting World War I, and as a result, pay enormous reparations to the Allied powers for their war losses. The treaty, known as the Treaty of Versailles, was signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo. Germans were furious about this treaty, and they saw it more as a dictated peace than anything else, and moreover, their burden of reparations topped 132 billion gold Reichsmarks, which is the equivalent of $33 billion. Germany did not have the ability or the resources to pay this huge a sum, and in fact, economist John Maynard Keynes predicted that the European economy would collapse if Germany did. With respect to the other Central Powers, Austria-Hungary was completely dismantled. It was broken into Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which was essentially Yugoslavia. Austria, which was entirely German-speaking, was denied the right to be attached to Germany. The Ottoman Empire was completely abolished, and a Treaty of Sèvres was proposed in August of 1920, which was rejected by Turkey, and this was followed by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which was acceptable to Turkey and was signed by Britain, France, Italy, Japan, Greece, Romania, and Yugoslavia, besides Turkey. The treaty recognized the boundaries of the modern state of Turkey, and Turkey gave up the Arab provinces within the Ottoman Empire. When it concluded, World War I ended up being the deadliest war at the time, with under 18 million dead, including 8 million civilians. And what added to the death toll was the outbreak of the Spanish flu pandemic towards the end of the World War I, which originated from the United States, and as the US troops started moving to Europe, the flu spread along with them. The Allied powers and the Central Powers suppressed the coverage of the flu pandemic because they didn't want the war to be suspended midway because of the pandemic. And it was only Spain, which was neutral during World War I, that provided the coverage of the pandemic, and hence it got its name, the Spanish flu, because Spain was the only country providing information about the spread of this pandemic. On the economic front, the European powers saw their economies getting shattered, and the United States emerged as a powerful world economy. However, Germany ended up being the most disgruntled after World War I, feeling betrayed by the leaders who signed the treaty and formed the post-war government in Germany. These leaders were actually given the nickname November Criminals. And it was a platform promising to reverse the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles that led to the rise of the Nazis in Germany. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. At the end of World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish leaders, that is the Young Turks, fled the country to avoid prosecution for their part in the Armenian genocide. What country did they flee to? After the Ottomans surrendered in 1918, the leaders of the Young Turks fled to Germany, which promised not to prosecute them for the genocide. But a group of Armenian nationalists, though, devised a plan known as Operation Nemesis to track down these leaders. So the answer is A, Germany. Question for the current episode. Which European monarch fought on the front lines during World War I? Was it A, Germany's Wilhelm II, B, UK's King George V, C, Bulgaria's Ferdinand I, or D, Russia's Tsar Nicholas II? Once again, which European monarch fought on the front lines during World War I? Was it A, Germany's Wilhelm II, B, UK's King George V, C, Bulgaria's Ferdinand I, or D, Russia's Tsar Nicholas II? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we focus on the Middle East and look at the history of attempts at peace within that region. Yes, with so much turmoil in the region, what attempts were made by various parties to broker peace between the warring factions. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.